Welcome, everyone, to our series of conversations on biopolitics and democracy. In these conversations, our intention is to raise awareness about the political tensions that mark the ways in which states and society are facing the current global health crisis, and understand how the pandemic has transformed our forms of life. We would also like to propose a collective and critical exercise of political imagination for possible futures after the pandemic. And today we're thrilled to have Professor Fabienne Peter with us. Professor Peter is professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick, and she specializes in moral and political philosophy and epistemology. She works mainly in democratic theory, and she has published recently a book on democratic legitimacy, and she's the author of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on political legitimacy. Thanks so much, Fabienne, for being here with us. We are thrilled to have you. And I guess that I would just start with the first quite general question. Do you think the pandemic has impacted our notions of citizenship and democratic participation? And if that's the case, how?
Well, thank you so much, Daniele and Federico, first of all, for having me, but also for great questions such as this one. It's a great pleasure to be talking to you about these issues. So yes, definitely, I think it has impacted on our notions of democratic citizenship, democratic participation. And it seems to me there are two main lessons to be learned. The first is that the citizen's voice matters. Right? Democratic decisions or political decisions in general are made under highly complex, difficult circumstances. And we need to learn from each other about what we should be doing or shouldn't be doing in circumstances where a lot is at stake. And with regards to the pandemic, we've learned that, for example, we saw the importance of the citizen's voice, for example, in the early phases of the pandemic in Italy. I think that was a really good example because Italy was one of the first European countries to have been massively impacted, to a terrible situation in especially the north of Italy that justified a fairly severe lockdown, which was an unprecedented set of measures in Europe, at least for a long time. And after a while, protests started, right, of people being concerned about their economic security, mental health issues, children's education, etc., expressing their frustrations with those very difficult circumstances. And while I think at the time, there was obviously no vaccine yet, we learned a little bit about the virus, but not a huge amount. Probably those protests didn't undermine the justification for a lockdown or other severe restrictions altogether, but they taught us something about the importance of a range of considerations and thus put pressure on the justification on the measures that had been put in place. And I think that is a really good example of, even in difficult circumstances, even when a lot is at stake, we still need to learn from each other because no one really has a good grasp of everything. And so these protests were important. So that's the first lesson. Citizen voice matters. But, and to some extent in tension with that, I think we've also learned that democratic legitimization or everyone having equal say isn't necessarily always the only route to legitimate decision-making. So there are limits to the legitimizing force of a political will. And I think we have learned that from the pandemic. I've thought about these issues for a long time. And pre-pandemic, I wrote a paper where I illustrated the issue with what might be called the sort of Mickey Mouse case, right? The sort of a case that felt quite fictional at the time. It's a bridge case. So the example I used was, suppose there's a town that needs to build a bridge over its river or renovate the bridge. And suppose, and now that's the sort of artificial part of the example, suppose the only remaining issue is the bridge stable? Now, obviously, if it's stable, it will come at huge cost. If it's built, people will drown, people will die. And so I argued, suppose that also in this scenario, there is a town engineer who has a robust track record on this issue or on issues like this. And she advises not to build the bridge because it's not stable. In a scenario like that, seeking a democratic decision on this matter, should we build that bridge, is at best redundant. If they vote yes, if they vote no, we shouldn't build the bridge. If they vote in a way that accords with the recommendation of the town engineer, or in the worst scenario, they go against that advice and vote in favor of building the bridge, leading to massive deaths. So in a case like that, democratic decision-making seems to me can't really do anything in terms of the legitimization of the decision, and it's even potentially dangerous. That is, it introduces a kind of arbitrariness that could produce really terrible outcomes. So I think we've learned both lessons. The citizens' voice matters, but there are limits to the democratic legitimization of decisions.
Thank you, Fabienne. That's very interesting. Perhaps that connects to a second question we would have for you, which is, if you see a tension between the mechanisms put in place by states to protect populations during the pandemic and the full exercise of democratic rights and participation.
Yes, I suppose it depends on what we mean by the full exercise. Right? So do we mean a kind of full exercise that is unlimited? Sometimes we get that idea from some sort of populist theories that the only route to legitimacy is some form of expression of popular will on a matter. But this idea that there should be no restrictions on the citizens' will, on the political will, and that the only appropriate exercise of political rights is the unlimited exercise of political rights, probably can't be right. And I think most democratic theorists would reject that, because at the very least, it is necessary to protect democracy. So any exercise of political rights in a democratic context is a limited exercise, because the exercise of those political rights can't undermine the democracy or the democratic institutions itself. So the only the full exercise of political rights in a democracy has to be a limited exercise of sorts. So the question is then, what are appropriate limits to the exercise of the citizens' political rights? And I just illustrated one set of limits, which come from the very need to protect democracy itself, because otherwise majority decisions might undermine democracy by taking away the rights of some minorities, gradually lead to the erosion of democracy. So the protection of democracy is one set of limits on the sort of appropriate exercise of political rights. But I think there is another set of limits, which we see in the bridge case, and I think we saw also early on in the pandemic, when it looked like there was a robust evidence on what needed to be done to prevent potentially millions of deaths. So in a scenario like that, when there is, like in the bridge case, sufficient expertise, it seems to me that can also be a source that limits the appropriate exercise of political rights, because we can't use our political rights to put millions and millions of lives at risk willingly, knowingly. So there are limits there too.
Thank you, Fabienne. This is very convincing. And I guess the next question is, what about the political role of expertise? And do you think that we learn anything from the COVID-19 pandemic about the political role of experts? And I guess the broader question is, what are the conditions for the legitimacy of scientific expertise in the broad sense of the term? And how do we kind of go from what experts tell us to political decisions, right? How does that process work in your view?
Yeah, great question, and really difficult question. Right? So perhaps to answer it, first thing I do is draw a distinction between scientific expertise and what we might want to call political expertise. Right? We obviously have a lot of scientific expertise on lots of questions, including questions that bear on political decision making. So, for example, how does a disease spread? Right? But scientific expertise of this kind is distinct from what we might call political expertise, which is expertise on the question of what should we do, right? So the question, what should we do, may be related to all sorts of insights that we might gain from science and other sources. To illustrate, in the Flint water crisis, an important source were the citizens who said there's something wrong with our water. Right? They had expertise of a certain kind here on the issue that something needed to be done to deal with the tap water. So political expertise, which may or may not be related to scientific expertise, is very hard to get, right? But that's not to say that we can't get it. And I think at least some of the decision making that in the context of the pandemic, and as illustrated in the bridge case, at least in theory, we can imagine scenarios where there are situations where there is political expertise on what the right decision is. And then I argue in a book that I'm currently sort of finalizing, the working title is The Grounds of Political Legitimacy. I argue that there are two grounds of political legitimacy. One is the political will, the equal authoritativeness of the citizens. That's a sort of take on the source of legitimacy, or the ground of legitimacy, as I call it, that is that we know a lot about. We're very familiar with this idea that the route to legitimacy is the political will. But that is an important ground. It's not the only ground. So what I argue in the book is that there is another ground, and that is epistemic advantage, or what I call it normative authority, which I understand as an entitlement to make binding political decisions based on epistemic advantage, based on a superior grasp on what the right decision is in certain circumstances. One can also say based on political expertise. Right? So that second ground, I think, is important, and the pandemic has made it clear that how it can play a role in legitimate decision-making, but the conditions are rarely favorable. The epistemic circumstances of politics, as I call them, make it very difficult to develop that sort of superior grasp on what the right decision is. In almost all scenarios, facts and values are entangled in political decision-making in a way that it makes it impossible to develop what I call political expertise, that sort of grasp on what the right decision is. There's lots of room for disagreement. But if the conditions are in place, then yes, political expertise, on my view, can be a ground for legitimate political decision-making. In order for there to be that sort of ground of legitimacy, for political expertise to become relevant as a source of legitimacy, the conditions, some demanding conditions have to be in place. So, for example, we need to, for someone to have that sort of political expertise, they need to be able to take into account all relevant evidence, no matter how scattered. They need to have expertise on the question of what to do, not just sub-questions, which may be relevant, but not decisive on the question what to do. And it must be possible to identify those with that sort of expertise, because if they are multiple candidates and they disagree, again, we don't have a path to legitimate decision-making based on political expertise. So the decisions are difficult to meet, the conditions are difficult to meet, but not impossible. So what decides which ground is relevant? And the way I think about this, which I suppose is not the way in which most people think about it at the moment, I'm hoping to convince them, is that the political will as a ground of legitimacy or democracy, as a way of ensuring legitimate decision-making, is, normatively speaking, a secondary ground. That is, when the epistemic circumstances are such that we're not sure what the right decision is, which is almost always the case, right, that justifies the idea of, or gives support to the idea that we are equally politically authoritative, in the same boat. None of us knows, right, what the right decision is. So that's a negative argument for democracy, as I call it. But in those rare epistemic circumstances where we do have that superior grasp and there's a lot at stake, so there are no sort of pragmatic reasons for democracy that could sway us towards democracy, then political expertise, if it's available, can be a ground. I hope that answers the question. It's a slightly long answer, but it's complex.
No, I guess it does. It is indeed a complex question. And I think that, drawing from this reflection on political expertise and your first answer about the citizen's voice, that leads me to think a bit about the place of disagreement in that scenario. And in the pandemic, we've been witnessing forms of difficult, dangerous disagreement, complicated forms of disagreement. So how do you think in this paradigm that states and society should respond to disagreement in core issues such as vaccines or self-isolation, for example?
Yeah, that's another great question. And so it seems to me that very first thing that we need, which we really don't have at the moment, I think we're suffering from the consequences, is a public sphere where we can actually assess our disagreements, articulate our disagreements and evaluate them properly. What we have at the moment is a public sphere that's highly fragmented in sort of different online bubbles, and that this fragmentation, this impossibility of coming to grips to what the opposing sides really think and argue, and what the evidence is in support, and what the strength is of the arguments that they have to offer. That, I think, really impacts on legitimate decision-making in a potentially catastrophic way, right, if we don't solve that issue. So I would say, when we ask how should legitimate political decision-making respond to disagreements, well, the first is create the condition for fruitful disagreements, right? And we really don't have that. And to creating those conditions, especially sort of also in our online environments, for fruitful disagreements is important because it helps us gather evidence, as we saw in the example of Italy, right? We gather evidence about the empirical conditions affecting people, but also gather evidence about their normative concerns, right? For example, what seems to have happened recently, to the extent that we can evaluate at all, is an increasing concern with infringements of freedom, right? That's a normative concern. Freedom is an important value. So having fruitful disagreements is a way of bringing to view and assessing the strengths of different normative concerns. Fruitful deliberation allows us to evaluate arguments, right, and see where an argument just doesn't follow. You think that you have a good defense of a particular political claim about what should be done, but in fact, the argument is weak, and there's a much stronger argument for an opposing conclusion. And finally, fruitful disagreements help us identify which ones are the real disagreements, the ones that we just can't eliminate, even with well-ordered political deliberation, and which are the ones we turned out to be based on partial evidence, misunderstanding of the argument, etc. And so the first step of my answer was the procedural one. We need an environment where we can have those disagreements and evaluate those disagreements. Once we have that, then we can evaluate which one are the, what I call normatively significant disagreements, right? The one where each side has a claim on what should be done, and the ones that are not normatively significant, where we say, okay, you disagree, but you really haven't taken into account all the evidence. You haven't really understood the argument. So we're going to go ahead anyway, right? We'll let you continue voice your disagreement, but it doesn't impact on the legitimacy of a decision that goes against it. So we need to get there. And at the moment, part of the problem that we're having, for example, in the anti-vax context, the decision, the deliberation, the public sphere is so fragmented that we seem to have no way of really penetrating these separate bubbles. And so no way of actually fruitfully assessing the strength of the opposing views. And that undermines any legitimate decision-making either way. We can't just ignore it, and we can't really do anything about it. So we need the conditions for fruitful deliberation first, in my opinion.
Thanks so much. It's really illuminating. And I guess to conclude our conversation, and perhaps going back to where we started, in a sense, what are, in your view, the lessons to be learned from these years of pandemic? You already mentioned 2 points at the very beginning, but also in terms of perhaps challenges for the future. In what concerns political deliberation, kind of in a nutshell, if that's possible, like where you see your own work also going from here.
Yeah, great. Yeah, indeed, I think the 2 lessons that I mentioned at the beginning are the key lessons here, namely, first, a lot can be at stake, right? We've seen this with the pandemic, and I predict, unfortunately, that we're going to be in similar scenarios in decision involving the climate crisis, right? At the moment, with the climate crisis, we don't yet have that sense of urgency, for better or wrong, for better or worse. With the pandemic, what happened once it started, right? There was this tremendous sense of urgency, which helped to focus minds, eliminate wiggle room. With the climate change debate, we're not quite there yet. People seem to assume there's still a lot of wiggle room, but unfortunately, I think that will close soon. And then then we'll probably find ourselves in a similar scenarios where there are lots at stake, millions of lives at stake, and decisions need to be made, and the right decisions need to be made, because the wrong decisions will lead to devastations and death in incredible proportions. So the pandemic has been a dry run, I think, in some sense, for the sort of decisions that we're likely to face with the climate crisis, and potentially, of course, other pandemics and other grim scenarios. And the other key lesson, it relates to the citizen's voice, and what I just said earlier in response to Federico's question about disagreements. We need a more functioning online environment, right? Where certain norms are instituted, creating a healthy public sphere where we can assess remaining disagreements about what the right decision is, the scenario that we're facing. So I could go on, but I think we're probably out of time soon.
Well, we are very glad to have had this conversation with you, Fabienne. It was a pleasure. And as Daniela said, it was very illuminating. I'm sure there's a different take on the kind of discussions we're having. So we definitely had some diversity in this conversation. So thank you very much. And we'd like to thank you, to say a big thanks to everyone who's watching us, and don't forget to check the other videos and interviews on our website. So thank you very much.
Thank you again. It was great talking to you.